The bleeding manuscript. I remember the letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday, its edges so damp I feared it would crumble in my hands. The inked address bore my name with such delicate, deliberate strokes that I could almost picture the writer hunched over a wooden desk, pen scratching late into the night. I had no return address to guide me, only a faint, musty smell like old libraries and something else I couldn't place, something metallic. Inside was an invitation. Join me at the Scarborough estate. I have something that might pique your interest. Aaron Blackwood. Aaron was an old friend from my university days. We used to study ancient texts together, long nights spent researching obscure manuscripts. It had been years since we last spoke, and this sudden note made me both eager and uneasy. Even so, curiosity outweighed caution. That very evening, I found myself stepping off a rattling bus on a deserted stretch of road. Darkness crept in from all sides, leaving only the flicker of a single street lamp and the silhouette of the estate in the distance. I trudged along the gravel path, the wind carrying the scent of wet leaves and something sour. Every step echoed with the hush of drenched stones, as if the night itself were holding its breath. When I finally reached the heavy iron gate, thunder rumbled overhead like a warning. Hesitation gripped me, but I pressed on. At the grand entrance, a single lantern glowed. A tall figure, Aaron perhaps, stood waiting. The light cast deep shadows on his face, so I couldn't read his expression clearly. Yet, as he motioned for me to follow him inside, I sensed a subtle tremor in his voice. "Come in," he said. "You're the only one I could trust with this." The manor's foyer smelled of lemon polish and old paper. High above, a chandelier trembled in the draft, sending fractured light dancing across faded wallpaper. Aaron led me into a small study at the far end of the hall. I could hear the timbers creak under our footsteps, like the building exhaled with each step. Inside the study, shelves lined with antique tomes stretched to the ceiling. A large oak desk stood at the center, scattered with papers, quills, and inkwells. Behind the desk lay a fireplace, cold and empty, despite the storm outside. Aaron motioned for me to sit, his hand trembling ever so slightly. "What is this about?" I asked, trying to sound calm. I wanted to believe this was a simple research project, but something in Aaron's haunted eyes said otherwise. He retrieved a cloth bundle from a locked drawer. Carefully unfolding it, he revealed a leather-bound manuscript with corners reinforced by tarnished bronze. Its cover, worn and scratched, had no title or author's name. Instead, there was a curious symbol stamped in the center, a stylized raven with a droplet of blood at its beak. "I found this in an estate auction," Aaron whispered. "It bleeds." I almost laughed, until I saw the genuine terror on his face. He opened the manuscript, flipping a few pages that looked yellowed with age. "The text is mostly indecipherable," he continued, "but whenever I read it aloud, the pages seep crimson at the edges." My skeptical smile faded. "You're serious?" "Deadly serious," he replied. "I need your help to translate it before it's too late." The words hung in the air, thick with dread. Something about that raven symbol, the hush of the room, and Aaron's urgency made me shiver. I reached out, running my fingertips over the embossed cover. Even without reading a single line, I felt an inexplicable pull, as though it beckoned me closer. We set the manuscript on the desk, its pages fluttering ever so slightly in the draft. The moment I cracked it open, a faint iron tang reached my nostrils. I glanced at Aaron, who stared back with apprehension. Part of me wanted to slam it shut and pretend this was all an elaborate prank. But that strange pull persisted. I read a few lines under my breath. The text was in an archaic dialect, reminiscent of Old English, yet laced with phrases I couldn't attribute to any known language. My pulse quickened when I realized that some letters seemed to shift on the page, rearranging themselves the more I stared. Suddenly, a droplet of something dark seeped from the margin. I pressed my finger against it, warm and sticky. Blood. My breath caught in my throat. The droplet splattered onto the desk, leaving a small crimson blot on the wood. Aaron grabbed my wrist, panic etched across his face. "Stop," he hissed. This is what happens when you read it aloud. More pages begin to bleed. He tore a rag from his pocket and wiped the spot. My heart pounded so hard I could barely think. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but my voice wouldn't cooperate. Finally, I forced a question out. How did you discover this phenomenon? Aaron swallowed hard. I read the opening paragraphs. Then the page bled. I thought it was some bizarre trick. But I couldn't stop reading, and the more I read, the more it bled. It was horrifying, yet I couldn't let go. It wasn't until I physically tore myself away that I stopped. My gaze shifted to the text. Even half shut, the book seemed to beckon. The letters seemed to ripple like a reflection in disturbed water. "We need to be careful," I murmured, placing a trembling hand on its cover. "Whatever it is, it's dangerous." Aaron nodded, stepping back like the book might lunge for him at any moment. Outside, thunder boomed, rattling the windows. The storm had worsened, as if reflecting the turmoil within the room. Despite the storm, neither of us wanted to sleep. Aaron fetched a stack of reference materials, while I retrieved my laptop from my travel bag. We worked by candlelight to avoid the flickering overhead bulb that threatened to go out at any moment. The shadows cast by the dancing flames made the entire room feel alive, as if ghostly figures lurked in every corner. Time slipped away. Hour after hour, we pored over old dictionaries, cryptic runes, and academic notes, searching for any clue to the manuscript's origins. Now and then, we paused to peer at the swirling text, too afraid to read another word aloud. Sometimes, I thought I heard faint whispering, but Aaron assured me it was just the wind. Eventually, I uncovered a partial translation in a centuries-old reference. "Those who read the blooded page shall be bound to feed its thirst." It was only a single line, but it chilled my blood. Aaron spoke in a hushed tone, as though the walls might be listening. "Bound to feed its thirst?" That sounds like a warning, or a curse. I closed the reference book with a trembling hand. This isn't just a legend. We have to stop. We need to destroy it. Aaron's expression flickered with indecision. He stood to fetch a fresh candle, but in that brief moment, I found myself staring at the open manuscript again. A single line of text seemed to glow faintly, beckoning me closer. My heart pounded in my ears as, involuntarily, I leaned in to read. Before I could stop myself, I whispered a phrase under my breath. Instantly, a thin line of crimson oozed from the margin. Horrified, I tried to tear my eyes away, but a strange compulsion seized me. My lips kept moving, reciting words I didn't understand. A sudden clatter shattered my trance. Aaron had knocked a stack of books off the desk to break my focus. Panting, I looked at him, my mind reeling. The manuscript's pages dripped onto the desk, leaving dark stains that formed eerie patterns on the wood. We both stood there, breathing heavily, each aware we had narrowly avoided something far worse. We decided we had to lock the manuscript away if we wanted to keep our sanity. Aaron placed it inside a large wooden chest, sealed with an iron padlock. We then stored the chest in a dusty cellar beneath the kitchen. The air there smelled like mold and stale earth, and the faint drip-drip of water from the pipes overhead lent the space a perpetual gloom. That night, sleep eluded me. I paced my guest room, lit only by the flicker of lightning through the window. Each time I drifted off, I heard whispers. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Distant, rhythmic chanting in a language that felt both alien and familiar. My heart raced whenever I recognized a word from the manuscript. In the early hours of the morning, I crept downstairs, intending to raid the kitchen for tea. In the hallway, I spotted a faint glow under Aaron's study door. My stomach knotted. I found Aaron hunched over his desk, a shaky candle casting deep hollows across his face. On the table lay the manuscript, torn from its chest. "How?" I began, but Aaron cut me off. "I couldn't stop thinking about it," he admitted, voice hoarse. "It's calling to me. I can't explain it." I felt an immediate rush of anger and fear. "We agreed to lock it up." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly distressed. "I know, but I had to look at it again. I'm sorry. It's like it's alive." A sharp crack of thunder made us both jump. The pages of the manuscript rustled without a breeze. Blood seeped from the text, staining the edges. I grabbed Aaron's shoulder, pulling him away. "No more reading," I insisted, voice trembling. "We'll destroy it at first light." But a nagging question lingered. Could this thing be destroyed at all, or would it somehow resist? As we stood there, breathing heavily in the half-lit study, I sensed the manuscript's silent defiance, as if it were mocking our intentions. Something told me this night marked only the beginning of our descent. At dawn, the storm clouds parted, revealing a gray sky that offered little comfort. Aaron and I carried the manuscript to the estate's courtyard. Once a stately garden, it was now overgrown with twisted vines and thorny bushes. We found a fire pit near the ivy-covered wall. I doused the pit with lighter fluid until the fumes made my eyes sting. "Are you sure about this?" Aaron asked, his voice shaking. "We have to try," I said. My hand trembled as I held a matchstick to the soaked wood. Flame erupted, dancing high and bright. I gritted my teeth, braced myself, and tossed the manuscript in. Instantly, my stomach churned with guilt. Guilt as though I were betraying something I loved. It was an irrational feeling, but potent enough to make me hesitate. The leather caught fire, and for a moment, a hideous screech echoed around us. I blinked in disbelief. Aaron's face mirrored my horror. Thick, dark smoke curled into the air, smelling not of burning leather but of rotten meat. I gagged as acrid fumes filled my lungs. The flames devoured the cover, but then, with a violent hiss, the fire sputtered. Sparks flew, forcing us back. We shielded our faces, coughing and gasping. When the embers dimmed, we looked into the pit. The manuscript lay half-charred, pages curling at the edges. Blood seeped from the blackened corners, extinguishing the flames wherever they licked. Slowly, impossibly, the cover began to reform, the scorch marks vanishing before our eyes. In seconds, it was whole again, albeit stained in new sinister patterns. Aaron stumbled backward, nearly tripping over an overgrown root. My heart thundered in my chest. "That's not possible," I whispered, my voice echoing in the quiet courtyard. "We have to rethink this," Aaron said, swallowing hard. "Maybe there's another way," but I could see the hunger in his eyes. Each time he looked at the manuscript, it was as though it was reeling him in, hooking into his very soul. Reluctantly, we scooped the smoldering tome from the ashes and returned it to the house. With every step, I felt the weight of our failure. We had tried to destroy it, and it had resisted. I began to suspect it would demand a higher price than either of us was willing to pay. Exhaustion claimed me after the fire pit ordeal. I collapsed onto the sofa in the study and drifted into a heavy slumber. Almost immediately, a vivid dream invaded my mind. I stood in an endless corridor lined with towering shelves full of books, all bearing the same bleeding raven symbol on their covers. The corridor stretched so far that the far end disappeared into darkness. My footsteps echoed ominously, and each time I passed a shelf, a droplet of blood oozed from a random spine, slithering down onto the floor. The shelves seemed to breathe, gently pulsing as though each book had a heartbeat. I could hear a distant, repetitive chant that matched the rhythmic pulsing of the shelves. As I ventured deeper, the words of the chant grew clearer. It sounded like the language of the manuscript, whispered by countless tongues. Suddenly, one volume flew off the shelf, slamming onto the floor at my feet. It opened on its own, pages flipping in a feverish whirlwind until they settled on a single line. I leaned in to read, my heart pounding like a drum. "Finish the story, or it will finish you." My eyes snapped open. I was drenched in sweat, my pulse racing. Aaron hovered over me, worry etched into his features. "You were thrashing around," he said, voice laced with anxiety. "Nightmare?" I nodded, wiping my brow. My throat felt scratchy, as if I'd been screaming. "We can't let it control us," I muttered, but I noticed my gaze drifting toward the locked chest in the corner. Aaron took a shaky breath. "I've been doing more research. There's mention of a ritual, a way to end the curse without destroying the manuscript outright." "A ritual?" My voice came out hollow. Part of me bristled at the idea of indulging this book further, but another part was strangely intrigued. Yes, but it's incomplete. If we want to finish it, we might have to read more. Safely. If that's even possible. I could barely suppress the dread uncoiling in my stomach. We had barely escaped the book's thrall, yet the possibility of a ritual gave us a flicker of hope. Even if that hope came wrapped in horror. Determined to find more clues about the ritual, Aaron and I decided to visit an old archival library in a neighboring town. The estate's oppressive atmosphere weighed on us both, and we needed fresh air and a fresh perspective. We left the manuscript locked in the cellar, double-checking the padlock. The library was housed in a Gothic building with gargoyles perched on its roof, their grimaces illuminated by the waning daylight. Inside, long corridors of shelves formed a labyrinth of ancient knowledge. Dust motes swirled in the sunbeams that pierced the tall stained glass windows. The hush of the room made even our soft footsteps sound like thunder. We scoured the library for references to cursed manuscripts, ancient rituals, and forbidden texts. Hours slipped by with little success. Then, just as frustration took hold, Aaron unearthed a small, handwritten diary bound in worn green leather. The date on the first page read 1817. In cramped script, the diary spoke of a blood-scribed book said to trap the souls of its readers. One entry described how the caretaker of the tome attempted a ritual to free himself from its curse. A sacrifice by willing blood under moonlight. My heart pounded. It sounded gruesome, but it was the closest thing to a lead we had found. Aaron's eyes glinted with a mix of fear and fascination. We may be dealing with the same artifact, he whispered, running a finger over the diary's faint ink. But it mentions a sacrifice, I said, throat dry. Whose blood would that be? Aaron looked at me with unreadable eyes. We don't know yet, but maybe it's the only way out. We signed out the diary under false pretenses, pretending it was for genealogical research, and hurried back to the estate. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in blood-red hues. As I drove, an uneasy tension settled over me. Each time I glanced at Aaron, I saw the reflection of that same color in his eyes, and it filled me with a creeping sense of dread. Night descended with a clarity that exposed every star overhead. The moon, nearly full, glowed like a watchful eye in the inky sky. Aaron and I leafed through the diary's final pages, searching for a step-by-step guide. The caretaker's entries turned frantic, the handwriting more erratic, as if he were losing his mind with each new line. We must gather salt, candles, and a personal token, Aaron read, voice trembling. Then, under the moon's light, we recite certain passages from the cursed text. Blood must be spilled onto the final page to break the hold. My stomach churned. We're supposed to read it aloud again? That's how it gains power. Aaron nodded solemnly, tapping a trembling finger on the text. The caretaker wrote that the only way to break its grip is to finish what was started. The obsession compels readers to complete the story. If the ritual ends properly, maybe we walk away free. I felt cold dread settle over me. We'd barely escaped reading a handful of lines. Now we were considering a full recitation, but the alternative was unending torment, or worse. We gathered supplies. A circle of salt around the locked chest, tall black candles flickering in the gloom, and the diary pinned open to the instructions. The wind outside rattled the old windows, and I half expected them to shatter at any moment. My pulse thundered in my ears as Aaron carefully retrieved the manuscript from its prison. When he set it on the table, the pages rustled like dried leaves. In the candlelight, I could almost see a faint pulsing glow beneath the leather. Aaron and I exchanged a glance laden with unspoken fear. Then he placed one hand on the cover. "Ready?" he asked, though we both knew there was no such thing as ready for this. I stood just inside the salt circle, gripping a small utility knife. My hands trembled so violently that I almost dropped it. Aaron opened the manuscript, flipping to a page we had partially translated. At first, the text appeared garbled, but then the letters clarified, revealing a twisted script neither of us recognized. Yet somehow we understood. He began to read aloud softly at first. The words spilled from his lips with a hypnotic cadence, like a dark lullaby. I watched his eyes widen as the manuscript's pages darkened around the edges, seeping with fresh crimson. A primal urge flared within me, a desire to grab the book and read it for myself, but I resisted. As the lines progressed, the candles flickered, elongating our shadows into grotesque shapes on the walls. My breathing quickened. I could swear I heard voices echoing Aaron's recitation from corners of the room. The pages bled more profusely, droplets splashing onto the table. Then came the moment. Aaron paused, looking at me expectantly. The final line required a sacrifice, my blood. My throat constricted as I pressed the blade against my palm. I felt a hot flash of pain, then warm liquid trickling down my hand. With trembling resolve, I let a few drops fall onto the final page. Immediately, the manuscript seemed to recoil, pages fluttering in a frenzy as though alive. The flickering candles roared into tall flames, and the room filled with a roar of wind that threatened to snuff them out. My blood spattered the ink, merging with the text in a gruesome dance of black and red. Suddenly, silence. The candles stabilized. Aaron and I exchanged stunned looks, the distant thunder no longer shaking the windows. Could it be over? I searched his face for any sign of relief. Instead, I found only mounting horror. Though the pages had absorbed my blood, the words seemed to rearrange themselves again, forming an entirely new sentence we had never seen before. We stared, hearts pounding in unison. The manuscript wasn't finished with us yet. Dread washed over me as the fresh text revealed itself, line by line, like a slow, deliberate taunt. My blood had activated something new within those ancient pages. Aaron and I could barely tear our eyes away. We were reading the final portion of the caretaker's ritual, except now it wasn't the caretaker's words. It felt personal, directed at us. A single phrase stood out in the flickering candlelight. Blood must be given freely, or the obsession never ends. I felt my stomach drop. Hadn't we done just that? Yet the text implied there was more to be given, something deeper than a few droplets from my palm. Aaron's face turned ashen. He clutched at his chest, staggering backward. I feel like it's pulling me in, he gasped. His fingers dug into the edge of the table, knuckles white. I need to finish it. I can't stop. Panic stabbed through me. Was the manuscript feeding off his obsession, or was it feeding off mine? The caretaker's notes had hinted that the final step involved a deadly sacrifice, but it never explicitly stated what or who. Desperation tore at my mind. We have to fight it, I insisted, though I, too, felt the strange tug in my chest. A beckoning to read on, to bleed more, to satisfy the manuscript's hunger. My heartbeat drummed in my ears like a frantic funeral march. Aaron flipped another page, and a fresh line of script, in blood-red ink, spread across the parchment. We read it together in shaky unison. In completing this tale, the scribe's life shall become its final word. We both froze, minds reeling. The intention was horrifyingly clear. To truly finish the story, one of us had to give up everything. Our life. My vision blurred. This twisted fate was not what we had signed up for when we decided to explore old books and archaic languages. In a trembling voice, I said, We should run. Aaron shook his head slowly, tears brimming in his eyes. It won't matter. The obsession will follow us. You know it will. The manuscript's pages flipped on their own, landing on a blank page at the back. A single drop of blood welled at the corner, poised like a teardrop. It was waiting. The strain of our predicament drove a wedge between Aaron and me. Despite our close friendship, we became suspicious of each other's motives. He paced the study, eyes flicking to the manuscript every few seconds. Meanwhile, I hovered near the locked cellar door, debating if I should just flee into the night. But where would I go? Each time I closed my eyes, the image of that final blank page seared itself into my vision. It felt like a countdown ticking ever closer to a grisly conclusion. Aaron spoke in a near whisper, his voice trembling with paranoia. Maybe we can trick it. Some small animal sacrifice or a dummy text. Deep down, I knew it was futile. The caretaker's diary had made it painfully clear. It demanded a life freely offered. A chilling thought crept into my mind. What if Aaron considered me a candidate? I quickly buried the notion, ashamed at my paranoia, yet unable to fully dismiss it. The tension between us was tangible. We snapped at each other over the slightest thing. Every so often, I thought I caught Aaron glancing at the knife drawer. I tried to reassure myself it was just my imagination, but the mansion's oppressive atmosphere fueled every grim suspicion. Late in the evening, a sudden shatter broke the silence. I rushed into the kitchen to find Aaron hunched over broken glass, his hand bleeding. He had knocked a plate off the counter. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw the raw terror in them. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered, tears falling freely. "But it's in my head, telling me that one of us must finish it." Fear coiled in my gut. I knelt to help him wrap his cut. As I tied the bandage, my heart thundered. We were teetering on the edge, two souls trapped by a cursed manuscript that demanded a final, fatal offering. Amid our turmoil, an unexpected knock echoed through the grand foyer. My blood turned to ice. Who would visit at this hour? Aaron and I exchanged a wary glance before cautiously opening the door. A tall woman in a dripping raincoat stood on the threshold, her knuckles still raised to knock again. By the glow of the porch lamp, I recognized her as Professor Lydia Crane, an old colleague who specialized in folklore and rare books. I'd met her once at a symposium years ago. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced," she said, stepping in out of the rain. "But I heard from mutual contacts you were researching an unusual text." Her tone was brisk, but concern laced her eyes. "May I see it?" For a moment I considered lying, yet some part of me welcomed the intrusion. Perhaps Lydia could help. Aaron, however, seemed oddly guarded, gripping the doorframe as though reluctant to let her cross the threshold. Despite his silent protest, I led Lydia to the study. She examined the manuscript from a distance, eyebrows knitting as she read the caretaker's diary. "This is beyond dangerous," she finally said. "Where did you get it?" Aaron recounted his discovery at the estate auction. Lydia's expression grew grim. "I've heard rumors of manuscripts that feed on readers' obsessions, but never seen one firsthand. They're said to be bound by blood and dark magic." She hesitated, then added, "Burning it, burying it, nothing works. It must be concluded." A flicker of hope danced within me. "So you know of a way?" Lydia pressed her lips together. "There may be a method that doesn't require a human sacrifice, but it's uncertain. We'll need a highly specific incantation, one that completes the story in place of a literal death. However, I only have fragments of it. We'll have to piece them together carefully." Aaron's face was a mix of relief and fierce doubt. "And if we fail?" Lydia's silence was answer enough. Night had fallen completely, and the wind outside howled with renewed fury. The estate felt colder, as though a chill emanated from the manuscript itself. Lydia wasted no time sifting through her notes, scribbling potential verses in a worn notebook. Aaron searched frantically through online archives, while I organized references from the caretaker's diary. We formed a tense triad, each driven by the desperate hope of sparing a life and finishing the cursed story. Occasionally, a crackle echoed through the house, a reminder that the building was old and filled with secrets. Hours blurred, the flicker of desk lamps turning the edges of my vision fuzzy with fatigue. My mind threatened to drift back to the ominous final blank page. If we failed, the script might write itself in blood, mine or Aaron's. Suddenly, Lydia gasped. "Look here," she said, pointing to a note scrawled in Latin. "Thy life is the ink that must seal this fate, unless the word be spoken before the final gate." My heart pounded. The word? Meaning some kind of incantation? She nodded gravely. "Precisely. This might be the key that lets us end the tale without a life. But it must be recited at a particular moment. Just before the final line is spoken." Aaron let out a slow breath, relief mingling with fresh anxiety. "And if we get the timing wrong?" Lydia didn't answer. She didn't have to. The stakes were clear. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight. We decided that we'd attempt the ritual at the stroke of 3, the witching hour, hoping the alignment of time might aid our cause. Over the next few hours, we prepared meticulously, writing out a phonetic guide to the incantation. I practiced it under my breath, though I dared not speak it fully. My exhaustion weighed on me like lead, but adrenaline kept my senses sharp. Each tick of the clock brought us closer to the moment of truth, and the swirling storm outside felt like a dark omen. Still, some spark of hope pushed me forward. Maybe we could outsmart the manuscript's hunger. 2:45 a.m. arrived all too soon. The halls were filled with eerie silence, the storm outside subdued to an unsettling stillness. Candles lined the study, their flames dancing in the heavy air. We drew a large sigil on the floor using white chalk, referencing Lydia's notes. The shape resembled a stylized raven in flight, encircled by runic symbols. Over the chalk, we sprinkled a thin line of salt, an ancient means of purification and protection. The three of us took our positions around the sigil. The manuscript lay at the center, closed for now. My chest tightened at the thought of opening it again. But if we failed to follow every step, the result would be catastrophic. Aaron reached for the latch on the cover, hesitating. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the old Aaron, the friend who once stayed up late discussing literature, who never believed in the supernatural until it stared him in the face. He pressed down on the lock, and the ancient leather creaked open. The pages fluttered as though caught in a breeze, but the room was still. Lydia began reading the caretaker's instructions, her voice low but steady. After each line, we repeated an incantation meant to bind the book's power. As we progressed, my heart hammered. The tension in the room was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. At last, we reached the final passage, the same blood-red text that demanded a life. My throat went dry. Lydia nodded at me, signaling that now was the time to speak the word that could save us. But before I could utter a syllable, the manuscript's pages flipped violently, revealing the blank page again. In an instant, dark text spilled across it, forming ominous letters in dripping crimson. The script was alive, scrawling itself in real time. I felt a wave of vertigo, as though the entire room tilted. Lydia gasped, and Aaron cursed under his breath. The book was rewriting its own ending before we could intervene. The new text materialized in seconds, but felt agonizingly slow. Each letter bled into existence, forming a paragraph that spelled out our doom. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the notes for the incantation. Sacrifice the one who brought this curse forth, the new passage read. Their blood shall close the circle. Aaron recoiled in shock, stumbling back, eyes darting frantically. We all knew who had brought this cursed text into our lives. Aaron himself. He sank to his knees, face twisted in despair. No, I muttered, heart pounding. This can't be the only way. Lydia's voice trembled. We have to finish the incantation. Quickly, before the text completes itself, but the book had other plans. A gust of wind slammed through the room, extinguishing half the candles. Darkness pressed in around us, and the smell of iron and decay overwhelmed my senses. The manuscript's pages flapped violently, as though in protest of our attempts to break its hold. Aaron clutched at his temples, letting out a ragged scream. I rushed to his side, but he pushed me away, tears streaming down his face. It wants me, he gasped, voice ragged. I can feel it. I can't fight it anymore. Panicked, I turned to Lydia, who was frantically trying to recite the incantation from memory. Her voice rose over the howling wind, but the words seemed to evaporate in the air. The manuscript pulsed with a dark energy, the lines of crimson script shifting, rearranging, as though it were mocking us. A searing pain lanced through my head, forcing me to my knees. The incantation, the caretaker's notes, the looming threat of one final life lost. All of it blurred into a single, suffocating wave of dread. Somewhere through the cacophony, I heard Lydia's voice, faint but determined. Finish the word, finish the... Then, blackness. The world vanished in a rush of agony and swirling shadows. I regained consciousness slowly, my head throbbing like I'd been struck. When my vision cleared, I realized the candles were out, save for a single flicker on the far table. The manuscript lay open in the middle of the sigil, its pages no longer flapping. Lydia was nowhere to be seen. Aaron hovered by the fireplace, holding something, a long knife. His knuckles were white around the hilt. Shadows cloaked his face, but I could feel his anguish radiating like heat. "Aaron," I croaked, pushing myself upright. What happened to Lydia?" He didn't respond. I scanned the room, dread welling up. No sign of her. No sign of a struggle. Just the oppressive quiet of a house gone mad. Aaron finally spoke, voice quivering. "The book demands a sacrifice. If it's not me, it will be you or Lydia. I can't let that happen." I swallowed hard, panic constricting my throat. "Aaron, we can still do the incantation. There's a way." He cut me off, tears gleaming in his eyes. I saw it in the text. "If I spill my blood on the final page, it ends with me." But I'm terrified, my heart twisted. We were both exhausted, broken by fear. Every rational part of me screamed to stop him, to find another solution. But the mesmerizing pull of the manuscript lingered, whispering that a single life could indeed set the rest of us free. "Aaron, please," I whispered, stepping closer. "We'll find Lydia. We'll finish this together. You don't have to do this alone." He shook his head, tears falling. "You don't understand. It's inside my head. I can't live like this, always feeling it, controlling me. Maybe this is the only way out." Before I could react, he raised the knife to his forearm, drawing a deep slash. Blood trickled down, dripping onto the pages. The manuscript absorbed it like a thirsty creature, its text glowing a macabre red. My scream caught in my throat as Aaron collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. It felt like the house itself shook with glee, the windows rattling as if in celebration of a final, bloody act. Everything happened in slow motion. Aaron's blood seeped into the manuscript, staining the final page. I rushed to him, pressing my hands over his wound to staunch the flow. My own vision blurred with tears. "You stubborn fool," I whispered, voice cracking. "You didn't have to do it like this." But Aaron's eyes fluttered with relief, as if some tremendous weight had lifted. His lips moved, forming a silent apology. Meanwhile, the text on the final page began rearranging itself, lines twisting into new shapes. A faint glow pulsed within the crimson script, like the last heartbeat of a dying creature. Then, to my astonishment, a single word materialized at the bottom of the page. And, for a moment, the air felt still, devoid of the malicious presence that had haunted us. My breath caught in my chest as I searched Aaron's face, hoping to see life. His eyes were half open, consciousness slipping away. "No, stay with me," I begged, pressing down harder on his wound. Blood soaked through my fingers. My mind raced, thinking of Lydia, the incantation, anything that could still save him. Suddenly, the study door burst open. Lydia rushed in, disheveled and wide-eyed. "I got thrown out of the circle," she explained between breaths. "I came to..." "Oh my God, Aaron!" She knelt beside us, rummaging in her coat for a first aid kit. Frenzy fueled her movements as she applied pressure and used gauze to wrap his arm. "Keep him conscious," she ordered, rummaging for something else, her phone likely to call for help. My gaze flicked to the manuscript. It lay quietly now, the final page glistening with Aaron's blood. The single word, "end," remained. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction that the cursed story might finally be complete. But the more pressing concern was the friend bleeding out in my arms. As Lydia dialed emergency services, I rocked back and forth, clutching Aaron tightly. The house no longer felt malevolent, yet the cost had been devastating. I silently prayed that this conclusion would grant us some peace, and that Aaron would live to see it. The ambulance arrived in a flash of red and blue lights, illuminating the estate's tattered facade. Medics swarmed around Aaron, rushing him onto a stretcher. His face was pale, but he was still breathing. Lydia and I trailed behind, numb with shock and exhaustion. For a moment, I hesitated, torn between leaving the cursed manuscript behind forever or bringing it along for safekeeping. In the end, I snatched it up, wrapping it in a plastic bag. Something told me it was safer if I kept it under watch, ensuring no one else fell victim to its lure. At the hospital, Aaron was whisked into surgery. Lydia and I paced the sterile corridors, watching the overhead fluorescent lights flicker in a monotonous pattern. We didn't speak much, each of us lost in our own swirling thoughts of guilt and relief. Finally, a doctor approached, looking fatigued yet optimistic. "He lost a lot of blood, but we managed to stabilize him," she said. "He's not out of the woods yet, but he's got a fighting chance." Relief crashed over me like a tidal wave. I sank into a chair, burying my face in my hands. Lydia placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "The book?" she asked softly. "I have it, but..." I paused, considering the final blood-written word. "It seems inert, almost finished." Lydia nodded, though a trace of doubt lingered in her eyes. "If it truly is done, maybe we can ensure it never hurts anyone again. Seal it away in a vault, at least." The thought of returning to that dark estate made me shudder. Yet I knew we had a responsibility to contain this evil. "We'll do whatever it takes." Hours later, Aaron stirred in his hospital bed, eyes fluttering open. Lydia and I sat on either side, relief flooding us as we realized he recognized us. Though frail, his gaze was lucid, free from the manuscript's grip. I squeezed his hand, tears welling. This ordeal had nearly broken us all, but we had survived. For now. A week later, Aaron was released from the hospital. Lydia and I helped him settle back into the estate, if only to retrieve his belongings. He had decided to sell the property. Too many nightmares lurked within its walls. The once intimidating mansion felt oddly hollow, as though its dark soul had fled. We gathered in the study for one final act, to seal the manuscript. Lydia brought a reinforced metal box lined with protective symbols, each carefully etched. Together, we placed the leather-bound tome inside, locking it with heavy clasps. A hush fell over the room as the final latch clicked shut. Outside, the morning light filtered through the windows, illuminating floating dust motes. For a moment, we stood there, uncertain of what came next. The caretaker's diary, the monstrous illusions, the blood sacrifice. It all seemed surreal in the daylight. Aaron broke the silence. "We need to destroy it, or at least make sure no one reads it again." I nodded. "We'll send it to a secure archival vault, one that handles dangerous artifacts." Far from prying eyes, Lydia placed a hand on the metal box. "Even then, who's to say it won't find a way? Books have a way of getting lost and then found again. We must remain vigilant." A heavy sense of unease settled in my chest. We had closed the chapter on the manuscript's bloody tale, but some part of me worried about future discoverers. Would they, too, succumb to its dark allure? We walked out together, leaving the estate's doors locked behind us. None of us looked back. And yet, in the weeks that followed, I occasionally caught myself pausing over blank pages in my own journals, half expecting them to bleed at my touch. Late at night, I would dream of the corridors of endless shelves, each volume marked with a raven's symbol. Though I'd wake in a cold sweat, I'd remind myself it was merely a lingering memory. We had ended the story, but in the quiet corners of my mind, a voice whispered, "Some stories are never truly over. They merely wait for the next willing reader to turn the page."